Hello, welcome to the conversation here on News Central Television. This is the show where we bring you all the latest political updates and happenings on the continent. I am Gbenga Aborowa.
And I am Rita Omodia. On the conversation today, we will be discussing the issues concerning former Gambian President Yahya Jammeh, who is in exile, and the African Union Extraordinary Summit holding today at the Sipopo International Conference Centre, Malabo, Equatorial Guinea. Of course, we're expecting a lot of fundraising coming up today at this AU Extraordinary Summit. And we do hope that there'll be fruitful deliberation so far.
Yes, a lot of all eyes are in Malabo, the Equatorial Guinea capital, looking at this extraordinary summit. A lot of things are happening on the continent. Lots of things to discuss.
Humanitarian crisis.
Security, humanitarian crisis, food crisis, and water view. Let's hope they implement the findings and, the agreements after the summit. And also in Gambia, landmark decision by the government there to implement.
I think it's a good one from the government. I mean, how does a leader, Yahya Jammeh, have so many crimes committed in just a short while? I think there's a lot that needs to be done, especially for governments who somehow find a way to confiscate the government's treasury.
Yes, and justice does have to be served.
All right, now, so we start with the topic in Gambia, where the government has said it will prosecute former President Yahya Jammeh for murder, rape, torture, and other alleged crimes committed during his more than 20-year rule. The Ministry of Justice said on Wednesday that it accepted all but 2 of the 265 recommendations made by a commission that probed alleged crimes committed by the state under the despotic former leader from July 1994 to January 2017.
Now, the commission's report presented to President Adama Barrow and made public in December was based on years of eyewitness testimonies. In other developments, the United States Justice Department says it has secured the forfeiture of a mansion bought by the former Gambian president Yahya Jammeh for $3.5 million with alleged corruption proceeds. Jammeh is currently living in exile in Equatorial Guinea, which has no extradition treaty with the Gambia. Joining us to discuss this is Fabakary Jammeh, a lawyer. He joins in live from Banjul in the Gambia. We also have Ayesha Harun. She's a human rights activist. She joins in from Banjul. And Sirra Ndow, the country representative of African Networks Against Extrajudicial Killings and Enforced Disappearances. She joins in from Kanifing in the Gambia. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks for joining us on the conversation. Can you kindly unmute your mic, please? Thank you. Yes. I'd like to...
Yes, thank you for having me.
Yes. I'd like to start with Sirra. What's your take on the government's decision to prosecute exiled former president of the Republic of the Gambia, Yahya Jammeh?
No, the right step in the right direction, because the prosecution of Yahya Jammeh, not just Yahya Jammeh, but Yahya Jammeh and his enablers is something that really cannot be, one cannot escape in what has happened in the past, for the past 22 years that he was in the country, and with all the atrocities that people have heard around the world through the very public hearings that we had here in Gambia. So it's inevitable. It's he must and he will be prosecuted. So for me, it's the right step in the right direction. I don't think the government had a choice actually in making sure that they prosecute Jammeh and his enablers.
All right, Ayesha, while a lot of people, just like Sirra, have said this is a right step in the right direction, we know that survivors and victims have singled out the hit squad known as the junglers for most of the atrocity. They want them tried and punished. Who exactly are the junglers, and how many members have been indicted so far? Ayesha, can you hear us?
Okay,
all right, so we'll have Fabakary.
Fabakary, yes.
Fabakary, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, so tell us who exactly are these junglers and how many members have been indicted so far?
Junglers they are former members of the Gambia Armed Forces. They used to be called the
Let her in.
they are former members of the, let me say it like this, they are former members of the Gambian Armed Forces that are recruited by Yahya Jammeh and turned into a paramilitary group that are assigned to do his dirty jobs like killing human beings and other dubious activities. They are not under the command of the Gambian Armed Forces, they are under his direct command, and they are only answerable to him and some of his aides. So far, only few of them were detained. The others were released based on the fact that they accepted to give full disclosure to the Truth Commission, and based on that, they were released temporarily. And recently, others have also been released because they said they have been jailed for so long and they have not, there has not been any criminal charges against them. So they are also temporarily released. And one of their drivers is currently undergoing a trial in Germany by the name Bailo. So they are a group of Gambians that were former soldiers used by Yahya Jammeh to commit heinous crimes in the Gambia. And some of them are still at large, like Sana Manjang. He is still at large, and while others are also currently in the country, but they are at the moment working free. But the state is saying that they will be arrested anytime they are charged and anytime they are needed. So these are the junglers.
Thank you, Fabakary. I'd like to bring in Ayesha Harun. Fabakary did mention that one of the junglers, one of the members of the junglers known as Bilo, is currently on trial in Germany. It was a landmark case for killing a prominent journalist, Dada Haidara. Why is this case important that even outside the shores of the Gambia, justice seems to be served?
It's really important that another prosecuting Jungler Bailo because of being involved in so many people, including my father, because he was the first person who been made mention of the killing of my father publicly and my aunt, which is Marcy. So it's very important it's like a one step for the Gambia to get justice for what happened here in Gambia. So seeing another country taking that step forward to prosecute someone, a jungler who had killed Gambians in the Gambia, to be prosecuted in another country, it's a huge step for us as well, for the Gambian victims to also start with the prosecutions. Yesterday, we've seen the white paper of the government. We've seen how prosecutions have been highlighted in the white paper. So it would really help us to start on something around prosecutions.
All right, Sirra, while we're talking about this white paper, I know most of the things that people want is closure for the families and, of course, justice being served. Now, do you think the government's white paper on the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commission will bring the much-needed closure to the families of the victims?
I believe so. We are cautiously optimistic. The white paper really, most of the things, what we've been advocating for was for the government to accept the recommendation. We have been through the recommendations to accept them. And one of the ones that were rejected, we also were advocating for them to reject it. So for the victims, seeing that the government taking our take in, considering our take on the recommendation was very gratifying. And that gives us, it's the beginning of a new chapter, and the way it has started so far is very promising. If we continue this way, we believe that the victims will eventually get closure. Some of the things that are needed is for them to heal physically. Some of them are need physical help with their with their physical health, with their mental health, and for some of them still have the remains of their loved ones yet to be uncovered. So the healing is a process. This is a good start to it. And I think two of the actions that have taken out have already been helping victims, and victims are very happy about that. Is the renaming the arch that Yahya Jammeh had put to commemorate his taking over. Renaming that to Never Again Arch was one of the steps that really goes towards the process of healing. And also one of the biggest challenges that victims have been having is the perpetrators that were mentioned during the Truth Commission still serving in the government. And we saw the minister announce, we heard the minister announce, and I was there actually, and saw him announcing that all those people that are still working in the government and have been mentioned will be sent on administrative, will be suspended with immediate effect, whilst they look into the legalities of what needs to happen to them, whether they should be terminated, whether they should be, if we go into compulsory retirement. So they are going to be weeded out of the system, which was a big concern for victims in terms of the credibility of the investigations that they have to do, and in terms of really, for them to start seeing justice, it starts there. So yes, we are hopeful that the healing that we are all seeking, not just victims, but the whole nation, and reconciling to continue the peaceful Gambia that we all know and want and strive for. We are hopeful with these actions. Of course, these are just words, but at the end of the day also, the government's announcement is a commitment. By accepting the recommendations, they are now, putting on paper their, well, they already had the obligation. Without the Truth Commission, the government was already obligated to make sure that these things are addressed. But now them standing publicly, not just in the Gambia, but on a global platform, which that press conference was to make these statements, is very satisfying and very promising for us.
And I appreciate your enthusiasm, and I believe the government's move to say that those who have been indicted and are currently working in the system should go on administrative leave. Now, Fabakary, the man, Yahya Jammeh, under whose watch all these atrocities were committed, is currently on exile in Equatorial Guinea, and Equatorial Guinea does not have an extradition treaty with the Gambia, and 2/3 of the members of parliament still have to approve for his extradition. So do you think he will face justice someday?
Absolutely. The arm of the law is too long. So being in Equatorial Guinea doesn't exonerate him. So there is a huge possibility, and there are a lot of avenues that can be exploited to hold him accountable. For example, the ongoing AU summit, the extraordinary AU summit is ongoing in Equatorial Guinea presently. So it's a very unique platform for the Gambian authorities to discuss with other relevant stakeholders to see how to best come up with a mechanism that can be used to prosecute Yahya Jammeh. It's either Equatorial Guinea extradite Yahya Jammeh, or they do it themselves, because they also have an obligation under the international law to prosecute any international crime committed anywhere in the world, irrespective of the person or the place. So Equatorial Guinea is also under that obligation. And remember also, there are other countries that are involved when it comes to accountability for holding Yahya Jammeh to account. For example, the Ghanaians were killed in the Gambia. They were part and parcel of people that were killed by Yahya Jammeh, and they are in high numbers. So Ghana also could also work with the Gambia government to convince Equatorial Guinea to take action against Yahya Jammeh. Or ECOWAS, the African Union can also make a similar decision like what happened in the case of Hassan Habri in Senegal. Right. Yeah. So there are a lot of options that are available to be exploited in order to hold Yahya Jammeh to account. So being in Equatorial Guinea doesn't provide any protection or a safe haven for him.
All right, Ayesha, I'm going to throw that question back to you, because Sirra mentioned something important, words turning into actions. And of course, that's what a lot of people would want, that it's not just a white paper, but this thing turning into actions. So do you think that if we're looking at this, that Yahya Jammeh will actually face the law, especially with this alliance with Adama Barrow? Do you see Adama Barrow is taking this more as a political gimmick, because it's on this administration, and while he's saying prosecutions for Yahya Jammeh, we still have him having a bit of party alliance? So do we actually see more of a prosecution of this white paper?
Well, that is what we expected. That is what...
I want to hear from Ayesha, please.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I believe he would be prosecuted, because looking at the white paper, it says those who bear the highest responsibilities would definitely be prosecuted. And looking at the human rights violations that occurred in the Gambia, all of those were commands given by Yahya Jammeh to execute. So I think for me, I'm sure that Adama Barrow, with or without he forming a coalition with Yahya Jammeh, he would have to go by what is right, and the right thing needs to be done, which is making sure Yahya Jammeh is prosecuted, because that is what the white paper, they've accepted that recommendation made by the TRRC, that Yahya Jammeh is held responsible for all these crimes, saying that he was the one giving the orders to the junglers and other people who committed these crimes. So of course, he needs to adhere to that and make sure he look at Gambia first. And also, it's really important that if we really want to attain, if he as a president want to attain the never again in his rule, he will definitely make sure Jammeh is prosecuted as per what has been accepted in the white paper.
Now, staying with you, Ayesha, as somebody that suffered personal loss, you lost your father to Yahya Jammeh's brutal dictatorship. What will it take to bring about closure? Does this white paper mean that, you have closure? How do you feel? And what would it take to bring about closure for you?
I think for me, closure is to have the remains of my father, which has also been included as a recommendation in the TRRC report, and it has been accepted in the white paper that the remains of the missing person should be looked for. And as part of the recommendation made is one of the junglers would help the government to trace the graves of the missing person. I know it wouldn't happen in a day or two, even 5 years. We might not get closure, but one step at a time. And most definitely, we all know how enforced disappearances is always a continual violation. But I believe that the government will definitely do something in relation to that. We don't have the capacity currently to be able to conduct forensic and also be able to find where these remains are. But most definitely, closure would happen, but I wouldn't say it will be anytime soon for victims of enforced disappearances who are yet to see the remains of their loved ones. But for me, the most important thing is having the government to start implementation as soon as possible, because their certain recommendation need not to wait for a long time and might not need a lot of resources for it to be implemented. It's like urgent medical support for victims, and as well urgent reparations paid to victims who are really in need of these reparations to support their families, psychosocial support as well, ensuring the healing process of victims. It's really important that for psychosocial support to be included as part of the healing process to attain reconciliation as victims and as well as a country. Yes.
All right, Fabakary, whilst we're talking about closure for the victims now, we're looking at the fact that the U.S. government has secured forfeiture of the Maryland properties of the ex-Gambian leader. Now, according to the statement, is saying that the money realized, the sale of the forfeiture of the Maryland property will actually be given to the people who have been hurt by Yahya Jammeh's administration. How do you think that will proceed?
On a reparation bill, and I believe that reparation bill will soon be heading to the National Assembly for approval. So I think that reparation bill will regulate some of the resources that the means and methods how those resources will be allocated back to the victims, because the reparations are part of dispensing justice. This is a step also as part of helping victims to heal and to enable them also at least go back to the status that they were before the commission of those violations against them. So I think reparation is not well regulated in the Gambia because there was no law that governs reparation. But since the state has taken steps to come up with a bill, And once that bill is passed, it will become an act of National Assembly, which will become a law governing reparations in the Gambia. So I hope so that that law will take care of all the reparations that will emanate from the TRRC, and also any reparation that has to do with the victims of Yahya Jammeh.
Thank you, Fabakary. Now, Sirra, you're the country representative of the African Network Against Extrajudicial Killings and Enforced Disappearances. What are some of the stories you heard during the testimonies of the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commission? And what is your organization doing to stop this and also help victims of this enforced disappearances?
Yes, so ANAKED has been working on when it comes to the testimonies of victims from practically the beginning when the testimony started. One of the things that we have done and recently completed was summarizing the testimonies of all the victims that testified during the TRRC. So as you're aware, the testimonies were live on video. It's very challenging for people to sit down and watch those videos if they wanted to go through, and for documentation, for researchers, even for simple, and for lawyers, and even for the families themselves. So we've been summarizing them and putting them in publications called the TRRC Digest, and we published the final report, which is like a shadow report next to the TRRC report. The other things that we're doing in making sure that victim stories are kept alive, we have a museum, a memorialization center at ANAKED called Memory House in Kanifing. The Memory House really is a documentation of victims and their stories. We have portraits of victims' family members, including Ayesha's, that are on the walls with victims and their own stories, really directly from the victims. We also have personal items of the victims that have passed away exhibited at Memory House to make sure that the concept of never again is there, so that generations to come, we will not forget and we will continue to remember them. It's also important in the process of healing for victims to know that their stories have been heard. It is also very important in building a sustainable culture of human rights in the Gambia. So that is one of the things that we have been doing to make sure that the stories are out. In terms of impunity against enforced disappearance and extrajudicial killings, one of our mandates at ANAKED is also supporting victims that want to seek legal remedies. So we currently have 4 cases at the ECOWAS Court of Justice where we supported 4 different victim families, including a Ghanaian and one of the, including 2 of the migrants. One of them is Ghanaian and the other one is Togolese. And as you of course know, there are 2 Nigerians that were part of the migrants that were killed. So it is a regional challenge issue when it comes to the migrants. So one of the other ways of supporting and ensuring that impunity against enforced disappearance and extrajudicial killings is suing the government of the Gambia, the government of Ghana as well, to make sure that the governments are taking the right steps. It's not really about, but we want the governments to take the right steps to prevent these things from happening. And I think that going to the courts is one of the ways that victims are showing their voice, that they are part of, they're contributing to make sure that impunity, they're saying no. This cannot happen. You will not disappear our people again. You would not sit in the middle of the night and our family members disappear. And some victims since 1994, they have been waiting to get the remains of their loved ones. That's a long time. Their children now have children, and we need to make sure that our governments are doing what is right to make sure that enforced disappearances and summary executions are really addressed and prevented, as we have signed up to according to international treaties. And also, one of the things, I don't know if you're aware, that Gambia has not domesticated enforced disappearances in our local laws. Okay. Those are some of the things that we're advocating so that people can actually be charged with the crime of enforced disappearances, and the right measures are taken for victims.
All right, thank you so much, Sirra. Now, Fabakary, it's been more than 5 years since the former dictator went in exile. Now, do you think Yahya Jammeh has so much influence in the Gambia?
He has been a former head of state of the Gambia, so naturally he would have some kind of influence, that is in terms of support base. But that has dwindled a lot, because if you look at his support base, it's only it's only based on one part of the country, so it's very, very minimal at the moment. At the moment, he doesn't hold that voice that he used to hold even before the elections. So at this point in time, he has a very, very, small group of people that are, supporting him. He doesn't have that influence over the state institutions anymore, and he doesn't have that influence over how things are done in the Gambia anymore. So his influence has died out at the moment.
Thank you, Fabakary. I would like to conclude with Ayesha. This means a lot to you personally, the white paper and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's findings. Now, do you think, with the release of this white paper, are you confident that the government will take concrete actions to an increasingly skeptical public to bring about, to implement the recommendations of this white paper? And are you hopeful that justice will be served?
Yes, I am hopeful. What I've seen so far during the day of the release of the white paper, when the Minister of Justice, Dr. Jallo, was reading what was on the white paper, I was happy to hear some of the things he said before even having the white paper handy with me. So for me, I think the government would really implement the recommendations made by the TRC that were accepted and those that we have in the white paper, because looking at the angle in which they came from, and I believe that victims as well, I was happy that the inputs of victims and the work of civil society organizations that civil society that have been working with victims, most of their voices have been captured in the recommendations and the white paper that was accepted by government. And the representative of the Minister of Justice made mention that they would start as soon as possible. They would have an outreach, a nationwide outreach in the coming weeks to meet with other victims in the other regions of the country, just to translate the white paper into the different local languages and also meet with these victims just to tell them really what the government will be doing with the white paper, and there will definitely be a roadmap for implementation. So for me, I'm optimistic, and I think at this point I can say the government would do something, but also I would also want to see the starting point of the implementation as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you very much, Ayesha, and we can only hope that the government would fulfill the recommendations of the white letter. I'd like to say a very big thank you to you, Fabakary Jammeh, Ayesha, Harun, and Sirra Ndow for being a part of the conversation. We do appreciate your insight and contribution. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure having us.
You're watching News Central Television. We'll go on a quick break, and when we come back, there's an African Union Extraordinary Summit currently going on in Malabo, the capital of Equatorial Guinea. We'll be looking at discussions and and the effects of these deliberations on the continent. Do stay with us. We'll be right back. You're welcome back to the conversation. In the first half of the show, we did look at the developing political situation in the Gambia, where the government released a white paper by the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Committee recommending the prosecution of former President Yahya Jammeh. Now it's time to switch gears and move to the African Union Extraordinary Summit in Malabo, Equatorial Guinea. The African Union held its Extraordinary Humanitarian Summit and pledging conference today to deliberate on efforts by African leaders to address the current humanitarian challenges that Africa is facing and that are exacerbated by the socio-economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and disasters across the continent. Identify durable solutions to address the current humanitarian challenges, especially of humanitarian financing and those that contribute to post-conflict recovery, peace and development. The first session gathered African leaders, donors, as well as the United Nations Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, an emergency relief coordinator, to raise funds. Around 20 heads of state made the trip to Malabo to attend 2 meetings scheduled throughout Saturday.
Now, this is coming on the brink of Africa Day, held every year on 25 May, which commemorates the formation of the Organization of African Unity, or AU, the precursor to what is now the African Union, that is the AU. The continental bloc, made up of 55 member states, is driven by the core principle of African solutions to African problems. But critics believe the AU prioritizes power over justice and has had little impact on the continent's most pressing problems. Now let's...
L'Afrique compte aujourd'hui, selon les données mises à jour par les agences humanitaires, environ 113 millions de personnes ayant besoin d'aide alimentaire, dont 48 millions sont des réfugiés, des demandeurs d'asile et des déplacés internes. Il faut répondre en urgence aux besoins de ces personnes afin de préserver ce qu'il leur reste de dignité humaine. Si rien n'est fait, il faudrait s'attendre à une augmentation de ce nombre et à une irréversible plongée dans la sous-humanité de ces personnes. Le premier est une gangrène qui infecte progressivement toutes les régions du continent. De la Libye en Afrique du Nord au Mozambique en Afrique australe, du Mali en Afrique de l'Ouest à la Somalie dans la Corne de l'Afrique, en passant par le Sahel, le bassin du lac Tchad à l'est de la RDC en Afrique centrale, le terrorisme ne cesse d'étendre sa toile macabre avec des conséquences considérables sur les finances, les économies et la sécurité des populations. Quant au changement anticonstitutionnel du gouvernement, fléau récent, mais heureusement encore très localisé sur le continent, ils viennent marquer un recul des processus démocratiques engagés dans de nombreux pays depuis une trentaine d'années. Les délais de transition mis en place au lendemain de ces changements anticonstitutionnels sont devenus des sources de dissensions et parfois de tensions préjudiciables à la stabilité des États concernés et à celle de leur voisinage.
Now, that was the chairperson of the AU Commission, Mohamed Faki Mohamed, and he talked about the urgent need for humanitarian aid across the African continent and, of course, the emergence of continued and repeated unconstitutional change of power. Now, joining us to discuss this, we have Dr. Adeyoye Akiola, the head Research and Teaching Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, all the way from Johannesburg, South Africa. It's so good to have you join us on the conversation.
Thank you so much, and I'm really happy to be with you.
Thank you. All right, so some of the issues that are bound to be discussed, especially on Saturday, is the issue of the emergence of unconstitutional change of government. And we know that the West African region has been besieged by a number of coups in the past year caused by corrupted governments. How would you assess the level of effort put in by the AU to curb this trend?
Thank you so much. I was saying that Africans actually thought that they were rid of military coup because of those years of democratic consolidation. But unfortunately, in West Africa and the Sahel, the military have struck back and they are now in power. Both regional organizations like ECOWAS and the African Union have tried within their capacity to implement certain policies to deter military from actually consolidating in government. But one thing they have failed to do is to make sure that the military government in power actually handed over power immediately back to civilian administration. They have failed to do that. And they have the Lomé Convention that empowered the African Union to declare any unconstitutional government illegal and aberration and to do everything in their capacity to make sure that such governments do not really survive. But what we have seen are military governments stay in power now for almost 1 year in some of the countries.
Now, Dr. Akinola, during our intro, one of the things we mentioned is that the African Union heads of state are more interested in in power than governance. It's been one of the biggest criticisms of the African Union. It's seen as an old boys club, and it's not responsive to the yearnings and aspirations of the citizens of this organization. In what ways can the African Union make sure that its member presidents are more responsive to the yearnings of its people in order to prevent unconstitutional changes like the coups we've seen? Because they always, the soldiers will say, you know, one of the excuses why we came in is to ensure that we stop corruption and bring about good governance.
Thank you so much. That's really an important question. If you look at the patterns of integration in Africa, it has been different from what we have, for example, in the European Union, whereby acceptance to the Union was by meeting certain criteria. But in the case of Africa, it was just by being part of the African continent. So everybody, once you are a member of, once you are in Africa, you are a member of the AU. And one thing we have known about the AU is that it has become an association of head of states. So sometimes there's this comradeship, people protecting their colleagues, you know, across the countries, their comrades, because they have this relationship with one another. The regional integration in Africa is driven by heads of state and not bureaucrats, not policy makers that can be decisive in terms of actually implementing effective governance. And one of the criticism of the AU is that they have failed to curb governance. They failed to curb corruption, and the only thing they try to do is to react to some of those countries where the people have, you know, gone to the street and try to protest against an illegitimate government. The government could be constitutional, but many of the governments we have in Africa are illegitimate, and that's why the military are extremely bold to intervene in many of these countries. So one thing we also say about the AU is that they are disconnected with the people. They have no relationship with the people in Africa. They only try to coordinate at the top, so they deal with only the leadership, whereby if you go to the street and you ask people about African Union, many of the people on the street will tell you they have no relationship, they have nothing, they have nothing to do with the African Union. And that's not the case in other zones like the European Union.
Well, it seems a lot needs to be done by the AU. And talking about this illegitimate governments, of course, this brings about political instability, and that's why we've had a rise of coups. And talking about political instability also brings about insecurity, which is one of the main reasons why we have coups resurfacing in the West African region. So now, despite the Silencing the Guns initiative that is supposed to be for 2020, we still have insecurity thriving on the African continent. How do you think peace can be sustained in Africa?
One thing we say about African solution to African problem is the commitment of African leaders to actually the peace and security project of the continent. But we must also understand, angry man, we have read about the frustration aggression theory. We know conflict. Anywhere that in conflict, they can be easily mobilized to join terrorist organizations who offer them something like a means of survival. So where the AU and African government should start from is to try to increase the livelihood of the common man on the streets. Those are the people that are vulnerable and that can easily be mobilized for conflict and for instability. That's the starting point. It's not enough to say that the gun must stop by 2020 or 2030, but you must put in place institutions that will not reinforce inequality, that will not aggravate structural violence. The gap between the weak people and the poor people are certainly too wide. In such society, it is as if you are sitting on a lion, and one way or the other, violence is bound to break loose. So the first thing the stakeholders in African peace and security should do is to tackle poverty. That's at the roots of many of the conflict and insecurity we have seen across board. The people don't have a sense of governance at all. The government has no presence in some of these communities that are up in arms, and you wouldn't blame them because they have been exceedingly discriminated looted against in their own country. So the only alternative they have is just to take into arms. So government should try and begin to implement inclusive governance so that they can stem the tide of conflict and insecurity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akinola. One of the most important deliberations in this summit ongoing in Malabo, Equatorial Guinea is to address the current humanitarian challenges, especially humanitarian financing. When you look at African countries, a lot of them are aid dependent. And I know we talk about African solutions to African problems. So countries that are dependent on aid, a majority of them, how are they going to come together to raise funds to deal with these humanitarian situations? Or is this another talk shop?
Well, it depends on the commitment of the organizer, the heads, or the leadership in Africa. And one thing they have failed to do is actually to deliberately and involve the civil society organization, the private sectors. There are many companies in Africa. Many of them are running away from social responsibility. Instead of Africa turning to the West, trying to invite donors organizations in the West that are not too interested in trying to resolve whatever humanitarian crisis in Africa, they should look within. There are countries in Africa that can still contribute money to resolving some of these crises in places like independent Gambia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, countries like South Africa, countries like Egypt, countries like they can actually assist. And there are many wealthy people in Africa, wealthy individuals that the leadership of African government can begin to liaise with. That's how they need to raise this fund. Because to my understanding, based on what we have read, Africa need more than $12.6 billion to be able to cater for the needs of people in Africa. And that money is a lot. But I believe the African can raise this money without even looking at the West for assistance.
All right, Dr. Akiola, still talking about aid, especially African solutions to African problems. We also know that the AFDB has actually approved $1.5 billion emergency program. Now, what are your expectations and how far do you think this fund will go?
Well, depending on, there are many conditions to some of these fundings that may never come into the light. But if there are commitments, this is something that can go a long way, but it's not as if this will resolve all the problem. 1.6 billion is really so far from what Africa needs at this time, but one needs to appreciate the ADB for making such donations. There are organization that people can begin to approach. I mean, the stakeholders can begin to approach. I mean, civil society organization, philanthropist organization, even many African governments. If they are committed, they can actually raise this fund because people are dying of hunger. People are being displaced. People are dying of droughts, of cyclones, of floods, of other hazards in Africa. And what is humanity if lives cannot be saved? What are you governing if people are dying because of their lack of access to the basic infrastructure required for survival? So I believe the money would not do a lot, actually.
Now, finally, Dr. Akinola, if you can, please in less than a minute, what are expectations from this extraordinary summit taking place in Malabo, Equatorial Guinea?
Yeah, thank you. No matter what we think, no matter how ineffective we think this gathering could be, I believe that it is very positive. We can never run from a problem without discussing the problem. So I actually appreciate the 15th extraordinary session for discussing this. And I'm sure that something positive will come out of this. I'm sure money will be raised, people will make commitments. But, some of the time, the problem is not even about the availability of funds. It is the distribution of those funds. So my expectation is that this fund will be used for the purpose of which it has been raised. I do not want to speak of corruption. Let me just stop at this stage.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akiola. We do appreciate your insights. Thanks for your contribution. And Rita and I, hopefully the next Africa Union Summit, we will be presenting the conversation live from the sidelines. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Akiola. Of course, there are a lot of expectations for the African Union, especially even with the Agenda 2063, which listed so many things that the AU was going to prioritize on. So we're hoping and praying that these deliberations will actually be fruitful. This is where I will draw the curtains for today's edition of The Conversation. It has been a wonderful one. The first half, we talked about the U.S. for future that has been gotten, especially from the former president, Yahya Jammeh, who has been convicted of several charges of crimes, rape and human rights violations. And in this second half, we dealt with issues of the AU. Do join us again next week for another edition of The Conversation.
Bye-bye.